Sometimes, the deepest pain doesn't come from strangers, it comes from the very people you gave your life to, and when that happens, silence becomes your only language. The morning sun filtered weakly through the dusty curtains, touching the faded walls of Margaret's small servant quarters. Her hands, once delicate and graceful, now bore the marks of years of labor, rough, lined, and tired. As she adjusted her simple apron, her reflection in the cracked mirror caught her off guard. Was that really her? The woman who once sat at board meetings, signing contracts worth millions, now standing in a tiny room behind her son's mansion. Holding a broom? She smiled faintly, the kind of smile that hides oceans of pain. Mrs. Wilson. Coffee. A sharp voice echoed through the corridor. Margaret quickly wiped her hands and walked out. It wasn't the tone that hurt her, it was the name. She had been mom once, mother, mama, but now, to her own son and his wife, she was just Mrs. Wilson. Their maid, the home she built but no longer belongs to the grand Wilson mansion, stood proudly in the heart of the city. Marble floors, glass chandeliers, and a sense of wealth that spoke louder than love. Margaret had built this house with her late husband. Every brick, every window was part of their dream, but after her husband died, everything changed. Her only son, Daniel Wilson, grew distant. Success had changed him. And when he married Olivia, a woman with beauty and ambition but little compassion, Margaret's place in the house began to fade. At first, she lived upstairs, in a cozy room filled with memories. Then, Olivia suggested moving her to a smaller space for convenience, and eventually, she was given the servants' quarters, just temporary. They had said that was 2 years ago. Breakfast for the family. Good morning, Daniel, Margaret said softly as she placed the tray on the table. Her son didn't look up from his phone. Olivia appeared moments later, dressed in a silk robe, her perfume filling the air. Mrs. Wilson, she said coldly, please make sure the omelette isn't too greasy today. Last time it was dripping. Margaret nodded. Yes, ma'am. Every ma'am cut through her like glass. But she never complained. She glanced at Daniel, her son, now a successful business executive. His expression was unreadable, his warmth long gone. The same boy who once clung to her hand on his first day of school, now barely met her eyes when they finished breakfast. Olivia waved her hand. Clean the dining room. And please don't touch the piano. It's delicate. The piano. Margaret froze for a moment. That piano had been hers. A gift from her husband on their 10th anniversary. She had taught Daniel his first tune on it. Now it was delicate. Now it was off limits. Scene 3. The pain behind silence. Later that afternoon, Margaret stood in the garden trimming roses. It was her quiet time, her only moment of peace. The scent of the flowers reminded her of gentler days. Suddenly, Olivia's voice broke the calm. Mrs. Wilson, the CEO of Monarch Group, is coming for dinner tonight. Everything must be perfect. Understand? Margaret nodded. Of course, Olivia continued. He's a big deal for Daniel's company. We cannot afford to look unprofessional. So please, stay out of sight once the guests arrive. You can serve quietly and leave. No unnecessary talking. Margaret bowed her head. Yes, ma'am. Inside, her heart trembled. She had known the CEO once, a long time ago. Edward King, the man who had started Monarch Group, had once been her business partner and friend. But that was before tragedy struck, before her husband's sudden death, before she signed away her company to save Daniel's future. She wondered, would Edward even recognize her now? Scene 4. Memories. In the dark that night, as the house buzzed with preparations, Margaret quietly ironed napkins in the back room. The chandelier lights glimmered from afar, laughter echoing from the main hall. She could hear Olivia's confident voice entertaining guests. She could hear Daniel laughing, proud and professional, and she could feel her heart sink, not from jealousy, but from the emptiness of being forgotten. Her hands shook as she folded the last napkin. The sound of her husband's voice echoed in her memory. Promise me, no matter what happens, you'll always look after Daniel. She had promised. And she had kept that promise, even when it cost her everything. The guest arrived. A sleek black car pulled up outside the mansion. The driver stepped out and opened the door. Out came Edward King, older now, silver-haired, dignified, but with the same sharp eyes. Daniel rushed to greet him. Mr. King, it's an honor. Olivia joined, her smile rehearsed. We've been looking forward to this evening. Margaret stayed behind the dining room door. Her heart pounding, she peeked through the gap and froze. Edward paused mid-handshake. His eyes flickered, just for a second, toward the hallway toward her. Could he have seen her? No, she thought. It's been 20 years. He wouldn't remember. But deep down, something told her he did. A quiet recognition. Dinner began smoothly. Laughter, business talk, and toasts filled the air. Margaret moved silently between them, refilling glasses and serving plates. When she leaned to place Edward's dish, he looked up. Their eyes met for a split second. The noise around them faded. He frowned slightly, as if recalling a face from a distant past. Then softly he said, "Margaret?" Olivia's fork froze midair. Daniel blinked. Margaret's heart stopped. She forced a smile, whispering, "I'm sorry, sir. You must be mistaken." But Edward leaned forward, his voice gentle yet certain. "No. I never forget the woman who built Wilson Enterprises with me." The room fell silent. Daniel's hand trembled. Olivia's smile vanished. And for the first time in years, Margaret stood upright, not as their maid, but as the woman she truly was. The truth doesn't always scream. Sometimes it whispers in a crowded room and still manages to silence everyone. The clink of cutlery froze midair. Every conversation, every laugh, every sound dissolved into the tension that hung in the room like thick smoke. Margaret's hands trembled as she stood beside the table, holding the serving tray. Her eyes darted between Edward King, her old business partner, and Daniel, her son, the man now staring at her as though seeing her for the first time. "Margaret Wilson," Edward said softly, setting down his glass. "You built Wilson Enterprises with your late husband, Thomas. How could anyone forget that?" Olivia forced a nervous laugh. "Oh, Mr. King, you must be mistaken. Mrs. Wilson is our maid," Daniel interrupted sharply, his tone firm but uneasy. "She's just a housekeeper, Mr. King. The name must have confused you." Margaret swallowed hard. The humiliation burned like acid in her chest. But Edward's expression didn't change. His voice remained calm. "I see." He looked at Margaret again, his eyes softening. "Then perhaps I'm the one mistaken, but I could have sworn your mother's eyes looked just like yours, Daniel." Daniel froze. His jaw tightened. Margaret lowered her gaze, pretending to adjust the tray. The silence that followed was unbearable. After the guests leave. It was past midnight when the guests finally left. Laughter had long faded. Only echoes of shame lingered in the vast mansion. Daniel sat in the lounge, his tie loosened, his face tense. Olivia paced back and forth, her heels clicking angrily on the marble floor. "What was that?" she hissed. "Why did he call her by name? You told me your mother passed away years ago." Daniel's voice cracked. "She did. The woman you just saw, she should have been gone. But she came back when I was at my lowest. I didn't tell you because you were ashamed." Olivia shot back. "Ashamed that your mother became a servant?" Daniel's silence was his answer. Olivia folded her arms. "Well, congratulations, Daniel. The CEO you wanted to impress just found out your maid was once a millionaire businesswoman. How do you think that looks?" Her words were poison, and each one found its mark in the kitchen. Margaret quietly washed the last of the dishes. She could hear everything, every cruel word, every tone of disgust. She paused, staring at her reflection in the dark window. Her own son had buried her twice, once in truth, and once in pride. A knock at the door. There was a gentle knock on the back door. Margaret turned, and there stood Edward King, holding his coat. "Edward," she whispered. He smiled kindly. "Still working after midnight?" "You haven't changed." Margaret lowered her eyes, her voice trembling. "I didn't want to cause a scene." "I'm sorry." "Don't apologize," he said. "I just came to say, I knew it was you. I knew the moment I saw your hands. You used to wear that same gold band when we signed our first deal." Her fingers touched the simple ring that never left her hand. "The last memory of her late husband lost everything." "Edward," she said quietly, "after Thomas died, there were debts. I gave the company to Daniel, so he wouldn't have to suffer. I thought I was saving him. I never imagined." Her voice cracked. "I never imagined he'd forget who I was." Edward's eyes softened with sorrow. "You gave him your empire, and he gave you silence." Margaret nodded slowly. "He was all I had left." Edward hesitated. "And what about your dignity, Margaret? You can't keep living like this. Come back. Monarch Group still has a place for you. I'll see to it personally." But she shook her head. "No. I can't. If I leave, Olivia will turn him against me completely. I'll endure for his sake." Edward sighed deeply. "You were always too kind." He placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "But remember, kindness without respect turns into self-destruction." He left quietly, and for the first time in years, Margaret let herself cry, not from pain, but from remembering what it felt like to be seen. The storm inside. The next morning, Daniel avoided her. He didn't speak a word as she served his coffee. Olivia, on the other hand, made sure to twist the knife. "So," she said, stirring her tea, "you were quite the actress last night, Mrs. Wilson. Almost had Mr. King believing you were someone important." Margaret said nothing. Olivia smirked. "Just remember your place. Whatever story you think you had, it's over. This is our house now." Margaret simply nodded. She'd learned long ago that silence spoke louder than defense, But Daniel's hand trembled slightly as he picked up his cup. He couldn't meet his mother's eyes. Inside, guilt was eating him alive. Edward's call. Later that day, Daniel's office phone rang. Daniel Wilson? Yes, this is he, Mr. King here. Daniel straightened instantly. Sir. Good afternoon. Edward's tone was firm. I'd like you to come to Monarch headquarters tomorrow. There's a matter we need to discuss. Bring your mother. Daniel hesitated. My mother? Yes. Both of you. 10 a.m. sharp. The line went dead. Daniel sat there, stunned. His mind raced. Why her? What does he want? For the first time in years, he felt something he hadn't felt since his childhood fear. The night before, Margaret sat in her tiny room that night, folding freshly washed linens. The air was heavy with uncertainty. She could sense something shifting, something inevitable. Daniel knocked softly on her door. Come in, she said. He stepped inside awkwardly, his voice low. Mr. King wants us to meet him tomorrow. At Monarch. She looked up slowly. Yes? Yes. He avoided her eyes. I don't know why. But you'll come, right? Margaret smiled faintly. Of course. If it's important to you. Daniel's lips parted as if to say something in apology, perhaps, but the words never came. Instead, he nodded and turned away as the door closed behind him. Margaret whispered to herself, maybe this is God's way of finishing what was never resolved. The morning of truth. The next morning dawned gray and cold. Margaret dressed in her simple gray dress and worn-out shoes. She tied her hair neatly and held the same purse she'd owned for over a decade. Daniel, in his sharp navy suit, waited by the car, his face pale as they drove through the city. Memories flooded her. The buildings she helped design, the offices she once owned, the company name that still bore her family legacy. When they arrived at Monarch's towering headquarters, she hesitated before stepping out. Are you sure about this? She asked quietly. Daniel nodded, though uncertainty clouded his eyes. We have to be. They entered the glass doors together, one as a powerful executive, the other as a forgotten mother in servant's clothes. But what awaited them inside would turn their lives upside down forever. Some truths break hearts. Others rebuild them piece by piece. The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime. Margaret and Daniel stepped into the grand lobby of Monarch Group. Everything gleamed: glass walls, marble floors, and people who walked with confidence. Margaret felt small beside her son, who walked stiffly, avoiding her gaze. At the top floor, Edward King awaited them. He stood near the window, city skyline behind him. Come in, he said warmly. I've been expecting you. The revelation begins. They sat across from Edward's polished desk. He studied them quietly before speaking. Daniel. He began. Do you know who founded Wilson Enterprises? Daniel cleared his throat. My father, Thomas Wilson. Edward nodded. True. But not alone. He turned to Margaret. Your mother was the backbone of that empire, the strategist, the negotiator, the one who saved the company when others abandoned it. Daniel shifted uncomfortably. Sir, with respect, those were different times. She doesn't understand how business works today. Edward's eyes hardened. She understands loyalty, sacrifice, and integrity, things many executives today have forgotten. Silence fell. Margaret sat quietly, her hands folded, her eyes calm but shining with tears she refused to shed. Edward's offer. Edward leaned forward. I didn't call you here to humiliate anyone. I called you because I'm reinstating Margaret Wilson as co-chair of the Monarch Foundation. Her name deserves its place again. Daniel's eyes widened. What? Yes, Edward said firmly. Her wisdom built a legacy worth remembering. I'd be honored to have her back in leadership. Margaret gasped softly. Edward. I can't. You can, he interrupted gently. And you must. The son's guilt. Daniel stood up, his voice breaking. You don't understand, Mr. King. She left me. She gave everything away. Margaret rose slowly. I didn't leave you, Daniel. I gave you everything so you could stand tall. But I never thought my love would turn into your shame. He looked at her, then really looked. Her worn hands, her tired eyes, the quiet dignity she carried despite everything. Tears welled up. Mom, it was the first time he had said that word in years. Redemption. Edward smiled softly. Now that's the son I remember. He stood, offering his hand to Margaret. Welcome back, Mrs. Wilson. Margaret hesitated, then shook his hand, her heart trembling. Daniel whispered, Mom, I'm sorry. She touched his cheek gently. You're my son. I never stopped forgiving you. A new beginning. As they left Monarch that afternoon, Daniel walked beside his mother, not ahead of her. People stared at the woman once dismissed as a maid, now walking proudly into a new chapter of her life. Margaret smiled faintly at the sunlight. Maybe some stories don't end in pain, she said softly. They just need time to heal. Some wounds don't heal with apologies, they heal when truth finally stands taller than pride. The ride back home was silent. The hum of the car engine filled the space between Margaret and Daniel, but neither spoke a word. Daniel's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly. His heart was heavy, guilt mixed with relief, shame tangled with love. He had finally seen his mother not as a servant, but as the woman who had once carried an empire and him on her shoulders. Margaret, sitting quietly beside him, looked out the window. The city lights blurred past, and her mind wandered back through years of sacrifice, loss, and the son she had loved too much to blame. She didn't need revenge. She needed peace. But peace rarely comes without a storm, and the storm was waiting for them at home. Olivia's fury. The moment they stepped into the house, Olivia appeared in the doorway, arms crossed, eyes blazing. Well, she demanded. What happened? Daniel sighed, setting down his briefcase. Mr. King reinstated Mother at Monarch. She's co-chair of the foundation now. Olivia blinked. For a moment she didn't speak. Then she laughed, cold and sharp. You're joking. The Maid? Co-chair of Monarch? Daniel didn't answer. His silence said enough. Olivia's tone turned venomous. Do you have any idea how humiliating this is? Everyone in the business circle knows I introduced you as the son of a successful family, not the son of a housemaid. Margaret's voice was gentle but firm. I was never ashamed of my work, Olivia. But perhaps you should be ashamed of your cruelty. Olivia's face twisted. Don't lecture me, old woman. You've ruined everything. You couldn't stay in your place for even a day, could you? Daniel's voice rose, louder than ever before. Enough, Olivia. She froze. For years, I let you speak to her that way because I was too weak to stop you. But not anymore. Margaret looked at her son, his eyes finally filled not with pride, but courage. Olivia's lips trembled. So you're taking her side now? Daniel nodded. Yes, because it's the only side that's ever been right. The breaking point. Olivia's fury turned to desperation. You'll regret this, Daniel. Do you even realize what people will say? That your maid mother pulled strings to get her position back. Margaret spoke softly. Let them say what they will. The truth doesn't need defense, only time. Olivia glared at her, eyes full of resentment. You think you've won? You'll never fit into this life again. You belong in that servant's room. Daniel's voice was calm but cold. That room doesn't belong to her anymore. Pack your things, Olivia. Her eyes widened. What? I said pack your things. I can't live with someone who disrespects the woman who gave me everything. For a moment, the house stood silent, a silence louder than any argument. Olivia's expression shifted from anger to disbelief. She turned sharply and stormed upstairs, slamming the door behind her. Margaret stood frozen, tears filling her eyes. Daniel, what have you done? What I should have done years ago, he whispered. The long night that night, the house felt different, quieter, heavier. Daniel sat alone in the living room, staring at an old family photo. He was just a child in that picture, sitting on his mother's lap, his father smiling beside them. He could still remember the warmth of that home. The love. The laughter. When had it all slipped away? Margaret entered quietly, carrying 2 cups of tea. I made your favorite chamomile. He smiled faintly. You still remember. A mother never forgets, she said softly. They sat together, sipping tea in silence, 2 souls mending what pride had broken. Daniel finally spoke. Mom, I don't deserve your forgiveness. Margaret smiled sadly. Forgiveness isn't something you earn, Daniel. It's something you need. And you've needed it for a long time. He looked at her, really looked, and for the first time in years, he felt like her son again. Olivia's goodbye. The next morning, Olivia came downstairs, suitcase in hand. Her eyes were red, but her face was set. She stopped in front of Margaret. I hope you're happy. You've turned my husband against me. Margaret shook her head gently. I didn't turn him away, Olivia. I just reminded him who he was. Olivia scoffed and turned to Daniel. You'll regret this. Daniel didn't answer. He simply opened the door. When it closed behind her, the house seemed to breathe again, lighter, freer. The mother's reflection. Later that evening, Margaret stood in front of the piano, the one she hadn't touched in years. Her fingers hovered over the keys slowly. She began to play the melody she had once taught her little boy. Daniel appeared at the doorway, smiling softly. I remember that song, he said. Margaret's eyes glistened. You used to hum it in your sleep. He walked closer, his voice breaking. I'm sorry for forgetting who I was, and who you are. She reached out, taking his hand. Then start remembering, my son. Because it's never too late to begin again. A new dawn. Days turned into weeks. Margaret began her new role at Monarch Foundation, mentoring young entrepreneurs, inspiring others with her story of resilience. Daniel visited her often, humbled and proud. He began rebuilding his company, this time with honesty and respect. And every evening, when she returned home, he'd be waiting at the door, ready to make her tea the same way she had done for him all his life. Margaret finally had what she always wanted: not money, not power, but her son's heart back. When life takes everything from you, sometimes it's only to give you back what truly matters: your dignity, your voice, your worth. Morning sunlight streamed through the tall glass windows of Monarch Foundation's conference hall. Rows of young entrepreneurs waited eagerly, notebooks in hand, whispering about the woman who would be speaking today: Margaret Wilson, the forgotten founder, who had risen again. Margaret stood behind the curtain, her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted her simple navy blue blazer. She wasn't nervous about the crowd. She'd faced far greater battles. What made her heart race was knowing that, for the first time in decades, she would speak her truth, not as a mother hiding in silence, but as the woman she once was and had finally become. Again, the speech, the host's voice echoed through the hall. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mrs. Margaret Wilson, co-chair of Monarch Foundation. Applause thundered as Margaret stepped onto the stage. The lights were bright, the audience expectant, but all she could see in the front row was Daniel, sitting proudly, eyes shining with emotion. She took a deep breath. When I was younger, she began, I thought success was about how high you could climb. I thought if I built a strong enough empire, nothing could ever break it. She paused, her voice steady but full of feeling. But life has a way of humbling even the strongest hearts. One day, I had everything: a husband, a company, a son I adored. And in what felt like a blink, I lost it all. The audience sat still, every word sinking deep. I became invisible, she continued softly, to the world. And eventually to my own family. I was called names, treated as less. But even in that darkness, I found something I'd forgotten: that worth isn't given by others. It's something you carry inside you. Even when no one else sees it. A hush fell over the room. Some eyes glistened with tears. Margaret smiled gently. And today, I stand here not because I fought back, but because I chose to forgive. Forgiveness doesn't make you weak. It frees you. The crowd rose in a standing ovation. Cameras flashed, capturing the face of a woman who had turned pain into power. Daniel's eyes brimmed with tears. He had never been prouder in his life. A son's pride. After the event, journalists surrounded them. Mrs. Wilson, how does it feel to return after so many years? One asked. Margaret smiled modestly. It feels like coming home to myself. Another asked. Mr. Wilson, how does it feel to see your mother reclaim her legacy? Daniel turned toward his mother, his voice trembling with pride. It feels like watching the sunrise after years of darkness. I spent too long being ashamed of her truth, when I should have been proud of it. Margaret gently squeezed his hand. It's never too late to be proud, Daniel. The interview that went viral that evening, clips from her speech flooded the internet. Headlines read from Maid to Mentor. The inspiring story of Margaret Wilson, the woman who forgave the son, who forgot her. Messages poured in, people from all walks of life thanking her for her courage. Mothers who had been neglected, children who had drifted away. Her story became a mirror reflecting pain, forgiveness, and hope. Margaret didn't crave the fame. What touched her most were the letters. One, in particular, from a woman who wrote, your story saved me from giving up on my own children. Margaret folded that letter carefully and kept it in her purse. That, she whispered, is worth more than all the riches I once had. Olivia's return. Weeks later, as life began to settle into calm, the doorbell rang one evening. Margaret opened it and froze. Olivia stood there, her face pale, eyes tired. May I come in? She asked quietly. Daniel appeared behind his mother, tense but silent. Olivia stepped inside, clutching a small envelope. I saw the interview. I know I don't deserve to be here, but I needed to say something. Margaret gestured for her to sit. Olivia hesitated, then spoke softly. I lost everything, Margaret. The house, my friends, the respect I thought I had. Turns out, I built my world on appearances. And when that crumbled, I realized how blind I'd been. Tears welled in her eyes. You were never weak. You were strong in ways I couldn't understand. Margaret listened silently. Olivia placed the envelope on the table. This is a letter for Daniel. Divorce papers. I'm leaving for London. I need to start over. Daniel looked stunned but didn't speak. Olivia turned to Margaret one last time. For what it's worth. I'm sorry. Margaret's voice was soft. Sometimes losing everything is how we learn what truly matters. I wish you peace, Olivia. As Olivia left, Daniel's heart felt lighter. Not from her departure, but from his mother's grace. The garden of second chances. A few days later, Margaret and Daniel sat in the garden, the same one she used to tend quietly as a servant. Now, The flowers bloomed brighter than ever. Funny, Daniel said, smiling faintly. I used to think this garden was just decoration. Now I realize it's life. It grows only when you care for it. Margaret looked at him with warmth. You've changed, Daniel, he nodded. You changed me, Mom. They sat together, watching the sunset, two souls who had walked through fire and found light on the other side. A message for the world. Later that week, Monarch Foundation launched a campaign in Margaret's honor. Grace reclaimed its mission to empower women who had been silenced, overlooked, or forgotten. Margaret stood before a banner with her name printed on it and smiled. She didn't see power or fame, she saw healing. Thomas, she whispered under her breath, thinking of her late husband. Our story didn't end in loss. It just took time to bloom again. Sometimes the past doesn't knock to haunt you, it returns quietly to remind you of who you were and what you're still meant to find. The soft autumn breeze carried the scent of old books and fresh coffee through Margaret's study. She sat by the window, reading the morning mail, her glasses perched on her nose. Life had finally found its rhythm again, peaceful mornings, meaningful work, and quiet evenings with her son. But that peace was about to be interrupted. Among the usual envelopes lay one that stood out, thick, cream-colored, sealed with a golden wax emblem she hadn't seen in decades. Her fingers froze. It bore the initials T.W. Thomas Wilson. Margaret's heart skipped. Thomas, she whispered. The letter from the past. Hands trembling, she broke the seal and unfolded the letter. The handwriting was unmistakable, bold, neat, and loving. My dearest Margaret, if you are reading this, it means fate has given you more years than it gave me. And for that, I am grateful. I know life without me must have been cruel, and that you've had to make impossible choices. I left something for you, not money, not property, but truth. The one secret I couldn't tell you while I lived. There was someone who betrayed us, Margaret. Someone closed the reason our company fell so fast. I couldn't prove it before I died. But I left all the evidence with Edward King. He promised to give it to you when the time was right. Find him. Finish what we started, and please forgive Daniel if he ever loses his way. He carries your heart, even when he forgets it. All my love forever. Thomas. Margaret pressed the paper to her chest, tears spilling down her cheeks. After all these years, Thomas still spoke to her, not with his voice, but with the strength of his love. But the words "someone betrayed us" echoed in her mind. Ooh. The visit to Edward King that afternoon. Margaret went to Monarch headquarters to meet Edward King. He welcomed her with his usual warm smile. I received something this morning, she said quietly. A letter. From Thomas. Edward's expression softened. Ah. So it's time. He opened his desk drawer and pulled out a small wooden box, sealed with an old company insignia. I promised him I'd protect this until you were ready. He said it contains everything: financial records, letters, and the name of the man who caused your downfall. Margaret hesitated before opening it. Inside were old documents, faded contracts, and one photograph: a younger Edward, Thomas, and a third man she hadn't seen in years. Her breath caught. No. It can't be. Edward nodded gravely. I'm afraid it is. The betrayer. The man in the photo was Richard Hayes, Thomas's former partner, and Daniel's godfather. He had been family. Loyal, trusted, and cunning. Edward explained he secretly sold shares to competitors, weakening your company. When Thomas confronted him, he covered it up as market loss. After Thomas passed, he took advantage of your grief and manipulated the legal transfers. You thought you were signing protection papers, but they gave him controlling rights. Margaret's knees nearly gave out. All those years I blamed myself. Edward placed a hand on hers. You didn't lose your empire because of weakness, Margaret. You lost it because of trust. Tears welled in her eyes. Does Daniel know? Edward shook his head. No. But perhaps it's time he did. The truth revealed that evening. Margaret called Daniel into the study. He came in curious. What is it, Mom? She handed him the letter and the documents. His eyes scanned the pages, his face darkening with every line. Richard? He whispered. He was my godfather. He used to tell me stories about Dad's legacy. Margaret nodded sadly. He used you, Daniel. Just like he used us all. Daniel's voice shook with rage. He took everything from you, from us, and we never knew. Margaret touched his arm. We can't change what he did, but we can choose how this ends. He looked up. What do you mean? By reclaiming our name, not with anger, but with truth. The confrontation. The next day, they arranged a meeting with Richard Hayes, now a well-known businessman. He arrived at the Monarch boardroom, confident and smiling until he saw Margaret. Margaret Wilson, he said, forcing a polite tone. It's been years indeed. She replied calmly. Years since you destroyed everything my husband built. His smile faltered. I don't know what you're talking about. Edward entered, placing the documents on the table. You should. They bear your signature for a moment. Richard's mask slipped. That was business, Margaret. Nothing personal. Daniel stood, his voice cold. You stole my father's legacy and called it business? Richard smirked. You have your mother's dramatics. Margaret looked at him steadily. And you have no conscience. Edward stepped forward. We're filing a motion to reclaim the rights and expose your fraud. You may want to call your lawyer. For the first time, Richard's arrogance cracked. You wouldn't dare. Oh. I would, Edward said firmly, and so would she. Margaret met Richard's eyes. You taught me that silence is power. But you forgot truth speaks louder. The reunion of souls. Later that night, Margaret sat alone by the fireplace, staring at the flames. She felt peace, not vengeance. Daniel entered quietly, sitting beside her. I can't believe everything Dad went through, he said softly. Margaret smiled faintly. He was a good man. He died believing in people, even the wrong ones. But he left us his strength. Daniel looked at her, emotion heavy in his voice. And you carried it, Mom. All these years. She rested her head on his shoulder. We both did, in our own way. The fire crackled softly, and for the first time in decades, Margaret felt Thomas's presence not as a memory, but as peace. I think he'd be proud, she whispered. Daniel nodded. He'd be proud of you. The legacy lives on. The next morning, Monarch Foundation announced a new initiative. The Wilson Grant, a fund supporting widows who lost their livelihoods to betrayal and hardship. Margaret's story wasn't just hers anymore. It belonged to everyone who had been silenced, forgotten, or underestimated, and found their voice again. As she stood before the press, the sun shining softly on her face, she smiled through her tears. Thomas, she whispered to herself, you were right. Our story wasn't over. It just needed time to find its ending. Sometimes, being a son isn't about carrying your father's name, it's about carrying his courage, the kind that forgives, rebuilds, and restores what was lost. The morning light spilled gently through the windows of Monarch Foundation's new office. Everything felt different now, lighter, warmer. The weight of deception had finally lifted, leaving behind a quiet strength. Daniel Wilson sat at his desk, flipping through old company records, the faint scent of aging paper and coffee mixing in the air. He wasn't just running numbers anymore, he was searching for meaning. It had been 2 weeks since the confrontation with Richard Hayes. The world now knew the truth. The story of betrayal, justice, and forgiveness had gone public. But Daniel wasn't celebrating, he was reflecting the burden of a name. Margaret entered his office dressed elegantly in a cream blouse and charcoal gray skirt. She carried a small framed photo of Thomas and placed it on his desk. Your father used to say, she began softly, a legacy isn't something you inherit, it's something you build again when it's broken. Daniel smiled faintly. He must have known this day would come. Margaret sat across from him. He had faith in you. Even when you didn't see yourself clearly. Daniel sighed. I was blind, Mom. I let pride make me forget who you were, who I was. Now, after everything, I feel like I'm just starting over. She reached across the table and touched his hand. Then start with purpose, Daniel. Not guilt. Your father built Monarch with vision, you'll rebuild it with compassion. A visit to the past. Later that week, Daniel visited the old Monarch building, now abandoned and covered in dust. He walked through the empty halls, echoes of laughter, meetings, and ambition lingering like ghosts. He stopped in front of a faded sign, Wilson and Hayes, building futures together. His jaw tightened. Not anymore, he murmured, but as he walked further in, he found something unexpected, a dusty filing cabinet with Thomas's handwriting on the labels. Inside were old project sketches, community plans, and letters addressed to government partners, all dedicated to helping underprivileged families. It wasn't just a business. It was a dream built on service, and Daniel realized this was the true Monarch. Not profit, but purpose. He whispered to himself, Dad, I understand now. The vision restored. Back at the foundation, Daniel gathered the board members and Edward King. Margaret sat quietly at the head of the table. I've been reviewing our future projects, Daniel began. And I think it's time we return to my father's original mission, using Monarch not just as a company, but as a movement. A bridge between business and humanity. Edward smiled. That sounds exactly like Thomas. Margaret's eyes glistened with quiet pride. Daniel continued. We'll launch a new division, the Wilson Legacy Program. It'll provide education, housing, and career support for struggling families. No politics. No publicity. Just purpose. The board erupted in applause. Margaret whispered under her breath, Thomas. He's finally found his way. The unexpected visitor. The next day, while Daniel was finalizing proposals, his assistant entered. Sir, there's someone here to see you. She says it's important. Daniel looked up and froze. It was Olivia. She looked different, humbled, quiet, no longer dressed in designer perfection. Daniel, she said softly. I know I shouldn't have come, but I needed to see you one last time. He hesitated, then nodded for her to sit. I've been in London, she began. Therapy mostly. And working, nothing glamorous, just honest work. I wanted to apologize not for the marriage, but for how I treated your mother. She deserved the world, and I gave her shame. Daniel looked at her, conflicted. You can't change the past, Olivia. She nodded, tears glistening. I know, but I wanted to thank you. Because your story hers made me realize who I'd become. And I don't want to be that person anymore. She placed a small envelope on the desk. I've donated the last of what I own to the Wilson Legacy Program. It's not much, but maybe it's a start. Daniel stared at her. Speechless, Olivia stood, her voice trembling. Tell your mother I'll never forget her kindness. Goodbye, Daniel. As she left, he whispered, Goodbye, Olivia. I hope you find peace, a mother's wisdom. That evening, Daniel told Margaret about Olivia's visit. She listened quietly, then said, Sometimes, redemption doesn't come in grand gestures. It comes in small, sincere steps, and Olivia just took hers. Daniel smiled faintly. You always see the best in people. Margaret looked at him lovingly. No, Daniel. I see what pain hides, the parts that still want to heal. It's what your father saw in me when I was ready to give up. And it's what I see in you now. He leaned back, taking her hand. I don't deserve you, Mom, she smiled gently. You don't have to deserve me, my son. You just have to love me and live better. The Gala of Redemption. Weeks later, the Wilson Legacy Gala was held, Monarch's first major event under Daniel's new leadership. The room glittered with lights, music, and emotion. Margaret stood beside Daniel as he took the stage. Cameras flashed, but his focus was on one person, his mother. He began. Years ago, I thought success meant power. I thought love meant comfort. And I thought family meant perfection. But I was wrong. The crowd listened silently. I learned the true meaning of strength from a woman who had every reason to hate me, but chose to forgive me instead. My mother, Margaret Wilson. Applause filled the hall. Margaret's eyes shimmered with tears as Daniel continued. This foundation, this dream, it belongs to her. To the woman who taught me that no betrayal, no mistake, and no fall is too great for redemption. When he stepped down, Margaret embraced him tightly. You did it, Daniel, she whispered. You've become the man your father hoped you'd be. He smiled through his tears. No, Mom. I became the man you taught me to be. The night sky. Later that night, mother and son stood on the balcony overlooking the city lights. The stars glowed softly above them, as if Thomas himself was watching. Margaret whispered, Do you feel that? Daniel looked up. What? She smiled. Peace. For the first time in years, both of them did. Just when Margaret thought every secret had been laid to rest, a single letter arrived carrying words that could shatter or heal everything she believed about her husband's past. The morning sun had just begun to rise over Monarch Estate, painting the sky in soft strokes of gold and amber. Margaret stood in the garden, tending to the roses, the same ones Thomas had planted for her on their 10th anniversary. The air was calm, peaceful. For the first time in years, Margaret's heart felt settled. The company had been restored, her son had redeemed himself. And though Thomas was gone, she felt his presence everywhere, in the rustle of leaves, the scent of rain, the warmth of sunlight. She smiled quietly. You'd be proud, Thomas. We made it. But peace, she was about to learn, never stays forever. The arrival of the letter later that afternoon. Daniel returned from work with a small envelope in his hand. Mom. This came for you. There's no sender's name, just the seal. Margaret took the envelope and froze. It bore the Monarch insignia, the original one, from before the company's fall. But this wasn't from their records. The wax was newer. Her heart skipped. Who could have sent this? Daniel shrugged. Maybe another old associate of Dad's? Margaret hesitated. Maybe. When she broke the seal, a folded letter slipped out. Along with a faded photograph. She unfolded it slowly, and her hands began to tremble. Dear Mrs. Wilson, you don't know me, but I knew your husband very well. My name is Clara Evans. I worked with Thomas during the final months of his life. There's something you deserve to know, something he couldn't bring himself to tell you before he passed. He wrote a second letter, one he asked me to deliver to you personally. But I couldn't find you then. The world thought you'd disappeared. So I kept it safe, hoping someday, fate would bring me the courage to send it. This is that letter. I'm truly sorry for what it contains. But he wanted you to have the truth, not the version people told, but the one that lived in his heart. Clara Evans. Margaret's hands shook as she turned to the second, older envelope, yellowed, sealed, and bearing Thomas's handwriting. Daniel, she whispered. This is from your father. Thomas's final words. Daniel watched silently as his mother carefully opened the letter. Her eyes scanned the page, and then filled with tears. My dearest Margaret, if you are reading this, then fate has kept its promise to let truth find you. There is something I could never say while alive, not because I feared you, but because I feared breaking you. Before our company collapsed, I discovered a financial pattern, one that traced back to accounts I didn't recognize. I followed the trail, and to my shock, it led to someone I thought I could trust, Richard Hayes. But he wasn't working alone. He was being funded by a foreign investor, someone who knew every detail of Monarch's operations, every plan, every deal. And that person was none other than Clara Evans, my former assistant. But Margaret, before you judge her, know this: she came to me when it was too late, confessing everything. She'd been threatened, manipulated. She was trying to fix it. And in that process, she became one of the few people who stood by me when the world turned its back. I didn't tell you because I didn't want you burdened by more betrayal. You had already lost so much, I couldn't let you lose your faith in humanity. 2. If she ever finds you, please forgive her. She risked everything to send me that final report, the one that proved Richard's crimes. Without her, even my death would have been meaningless. You once told me, forgiveness is love's last language. I finally understand that now. If you can't speak it once more, all my love. Always, Thomas. Margaret's tears fell onto the paper, blurring the ink. Daniel reached for her hand. Mom, he carried this alone all those years? She nodded, her voice breaking. He was protecting me even as he was dying. The unexpected visitor. The next day, as rain poured outside, the doorbell rang. Daniel answered, and there stood a frail elderly woman with kind eyes, clutching an umbrella. Is this the Wilson residence? She asked softly. Yes, Daniel replied cautiously. Who are you? She took a deep breath. My name is Clara Evans. Margaret appeared behind Daniel, her face pale but calm. Come in. Clara entered, her clothes soaked from the rain. She looked at Margaret with tears in her eyes. You received it, didn't you? Margaret nodded. I did. I've lived with the weight of that secret for years, Clara said, her voice trembling. I betrayed your husband not by choice, but by fear. And he forgave me before he died. I've spent every day since trying to forgive myself. Margaret studied her quietly. Why come now? Because I saw the news, Clara said. Your foundation, your story. I realized you still live by the same grace he admired in you. I thought maybe, just maybe, you could extend that grace to me, too. Forgiveness. For a long moment, silence filled the room, the kind that carries decades of pain and unspoken words. Finally, Margaret spoke softly. Clara, my husband forgave you. That's enough for me. Clara's eyes widened. You don't hate me? Margaret shook her head. Hate would only keep me bound to the past. Thomas wanted peace, and I intend to honor that. Tears streamed down Clara's face. You're everything he said you were. Daniel stepped forward. Would you tell us about his final days? Clara nodded. He spoke of you both every day. He said he didn't fear death, only leaving you behind. His last words were, tell Margaret, she was my home. Margaret's tears fell freely. Now he always kept his promises, healing the past. That evening, after Clara left, Margaret sat in her husband's old armchair by the window, holding his letters. The rain had stopped. The moonlight spilled softly across the floor. She whispered, you carried so much, Thomas. So much I never knew. But I forgive them all, not for their sake, but for yours. She looked up, eyes glistening. And for mine. Daniel entered quietly and wrapped a blanket around her shoulders. You okay, Mom? She smiled faintly. For the first time in years, yes. Truly a legacy of grace. A few weeks later, Margaret invited Clara to the Wilson Legacy Gala. The guests were surprised to see her seated beside Margaret. During her speech, Margaret said, life has taught me that truth can wound, but it can also heal. We can't rewrite the past, but we can choose how it ends. Tonight, I choose forgiveness. Not because others deserve it, but because love demands it. The audience rose in applause. Daniel, watching from the side, felt tears he didn't bother hiding. As Margaret left the stage, she whispered to herself, Thomas, your truth didn't destroy me, it set me free. Sometimes love doesn't end with goodbye. It lingers in the quiet places, in old letters, fading photos, and the moments we think we're alone, reminding us that the people we've lost never truly leave. The Wilson household was quiet that morning. Sunlight filtered through the lace curtain, bathing the room in soft gold. Margaret sat by her writing desk, a cup of tea beside her, surrounded by letters, each one a piece of her past. The air smelled of nostalgia and roses. It had been weeks since Clara Evans's visit, since the truth of Thomas's final days came to light. Margaret had felt peace return to her life, like the calm after a storm. But sometimes, Even peace leaves behind echoes. She opened a small box, the one Thomas had left years ago, and found something she hadn't noticed before. A hidden compartment under the letters inside was a small velvet pouch and a folded note. Her breath caught. Thomas, the hidden note with trembling hands. Margaret opened the note. The handwriting was unmistakable. Thomas's firm, steady script. My dearest Margaret, if you've found this, then it means my plan worked, and you've finally learned the truth. But before you close this chapter, there's one more thing I need you to know. You've spent your life giving to others your kindness, your forgiveness, your love. You built everything around us. But somewhere along the way, you forgot to live for yourself. Inside this pouch, you'll find a key. It belongs to a place very dear to me and to you. I bought it in secret before I fell ill. I wanted it to be your refuge. A place where you could start again if the world ever broke you. Go there, Margaret. Don't stay trapped in memories of pain. Go and see what love built for you, yours forever. Thomas. Margaret's hands shook as she untied the pouch. Inside was an old brass key, engraved with 2 letters. W.C. The journey. Later that day, Margaret and Daniel stood in front of an old countryside estate, a small, charming cottage surrounded by golden fields and whispering trees. Above the arched door, carved into the wood, were the words, Wilson's cottage, built with love. Daniel looked stunned. Dad built this? Margaret nodded, tears in her eyes. He must have bought it before he died. He wanted me to have somewhere to heal. They stepped inside. The cottage was simple but beautiful. Wooden floors, white curtains, shelves filled with Thomas's favorite books. A faint scent of cedar and roses lingered in the air, as if time itself had preserved his memory. On the mantel stood a framed quote in his handwriting, "Love is not about holding on. It's about letting each other bloom." Margaret touched the frame gently. He always knew what I needed even when I didn't. The letter within the wall. As Daniel explored, he found a small wooden box tucked behind a loose brick in the fireplace. Mom, look at this. Inside was another envelope addressed to Daniel Wilson. My son, if you are reading this, then you've finally seen your mother for who she truly is, the strongest person I ever knew. You'll face a world that judges strength by power, but I hope you'll remember this. True strength is measured by grace. Build your legacy not on what you earn, but on what you give. And never forget, your mother is your compass. When you lose your way, follow her light. It will always lead you home with pride beyond words. Dad. Daniel's eyes filled with tears. He wrote this for me? Margaret nodded softly. He knew you'd find your way someday. He turned to her, voice trembling. He believed in me even when I didn't deserve it. Margaret took his hand. That's what fathers do, Daniel. And what mothers continue. The final gift. That night, after Daniel left, Margaret sat alone by the window, looking out at the moonlit fields. She felt Thomas's presence all around her, not haunting, but warm, protective, loving. She whispered, "You still find ways to take care of me, don't you?" The wind outside rustled the trees. Almost as if answering her, she looked down at the brass key in her hand and smiled. "Thank you, Thomas. For the home, for the lessons, for never letting me forget who I am." A promise renewed over the following weeks. Margaret turned the cottage into a retreat for widows and single mothers, a peaceful refuge where women could rebuild their lives. She called it the Grace Home. When the press asked her why, she said simply, "Because Grace saved me and now it will see others." Daniel visited often, helping her organize programs and renovations. Every time he saw his mother speaking with the women, encouraging them, listening, healing, he saw the very legacy his father had dreamed of. Dad would be so proud, Daniel said one evening. Margaret smiled softly. "He is the lanterns." 1 year later, on the anniversary of Thomas's passing, Margaret and Daniel stood outside the cottage with dozens of women and families. Each held a small lantern. Margaret raised hers and said, "Tonight, we honor the ones we've lost, not with sorrow, but with gratitude, because they taught us that love doesn't fade, it simply changes form." Together, they released the lanterns into the night sky. Hundreds of glowing lights floated upward, painting the darkness with gold. Daniel looked at his mother. "Do you think he can see them?" Margaret smiled through her tears. "He doesn't need to. He's already here, in every light, in every heart." They stood side by side, watching the sky shimmer, the past, the present, and the future finally united in peace. The final whisper. As the last lantern disappeared into the stars, a gentle wind brushed Margaret's cheek like a kiss. And in her heart, she heard Thomas's voice, soft and loving. "You kept your promise, Margaret. You turned pain into grace." She smiled, whispering back, "And you turned love into forever." Just when we think life has finally calmed, destiny reminds us healing is never a straight line. Sometimes, the storms we thought were gone come back to see if we've truly learned how to stand. It had been 6 months since the Grace Home opened. Every morning, The cottage filled with laughter, children playing in the yard, women tending the garden, hope blooming in every corner. Margaret had finally found purpose again. Daniel visited often, now humble and grounded, helping her expand the foundation. The Wilsons were becoming a symbol of second chances. But true peace rarely lasts forever. The news report. That morning, Margaret sat at the breakfast table with a few of the women when Susan, one of the volunteers, entered the room with a pale face. "Mrs. Wilson, you should see this," she said, handing her a tablet. A breaking news report flashed on the screen. Scandal in Monarch Group. Leaked emails reveal corruption in charitable partnerships. Sources link transactions to the Grace Home Foundation. Margaret's blood ran cold. Her name was there attached to fake documents. She had never seen Daniel's name to the confrontation. Later that afternoon, Daniel arrived at the cottage, his face tense. "Mom, the media won't stop calling. Monarch's board is panicking. They think the foundation was laundering money." Margaret shook her head firmly. "That's impossible. Every donation was accounted for, I know," Daniel said. "But someone planted fake records, and they came from inside Monarch's system." "Inside?" she repeated, frowning. "Who would do that?" He hesitated. "I think it's Olivia." Margaret's breath caught. "Olivia? But she left the company months ago." "She did," Daniel said, jaw tightening. "But not quietly. She's been angry, bitter. She blames me for losing everything after the divorce. She wants to destroy what we built." Margaret stared out the window. Her heart heavy. Anger can burn people alive and everyone near them. The return of Olivia. 3 days later, Olivia appeared uninvited at the gates of the Grace home. She wore dark sunglasses and a cold expression. Daniel was outside when he saw her. His voice was sharp. "You shouldn't be here." She smiled bitterly. "Relax, Daniel. I didn't come to fight. I came to warn you." Margaret stepped out of the doorway. "Warn him? About what?" Olivia's gaze softened for a moment, almost guilty. "You're not safe. Someone else is using me as a scapegoat. They forged those records under my name, but I swear, I didn't touch your foundation's money." "Then who did?" Margaret asked. Olivia hesitated, looking down. "Edward King's son, Nathan King. He's trying to take Monarch's assets after his father's stroke. He wants to discredit anyone loyal to your family." Daniel froze. "Nathan? But Dad trusted him." Olivia nodded. "And that's why he's dangerous. He wants what Edward gave your mother: her seat, her respect, her legacy." The betrayal revealed. That evening, Daniel drove to Monarch headquarters to confront Nathan King. Nathan sat behind Edward's old desk, calm and arrogant. "Well, if it isn't the Wilson boy," he sneered. "Come to beg?" Daniel slammed a folder on the desk. "You framed my mother. You forged those records." Nathan leaned back lazily. "Your mother had her time. Monarch doesn't need sentimental stories, it needs profit. She's a liability, and I'm cleaning up the past." Daniel's hands clenched. "You'll regret this." Nathan smirked. "Only if you can prove it. But I made sure you can't." Edward's last ally desperate. Daniel returned home to tell Margaret everything. She listened quietly, her expression unreadable. Then she said softly, "There's one person who can help, Clara Evans. Edward trusted her with every confidential file before he fell ill." Daniel blinked. "Clara? The lawyer?" "Yes," Margaret said, standing. "And she owes Edward one last promise to protect the innocent." The next morning, they met Clara at her home. She was older now, her hair silver, her demeanor calm but sharp. "I knew this day would come," she said, opening her drawer. She pulled out a sealed envelope marked "For Margaret Wilson." Confidential. Inside were Edward's final directives, documents proving Nathan's embezzlement, signed before his stroke. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "Edward, even in silence you still defend the truth." The trial of truth. Weeks later the case exploded in the media. Margaret and Daniel stood before a sea of cameras, facing the world with dignity. Clara presented the evidence, publicly exposing Nathan King's corruption and clearing the Grace home's name. When the verdict came, the courtroom fell silent. "All charges against Margaret Wilson and Daniel Wilson are hereby dismissed. Monarch Group is ordered to restore Mrs. Wilson's board position and issue a public apology." Margaret closed her eyes. Justice, not vengeance, had won. Olivia's redemption. Outside the courthouse, Olivia approached Margaret quietly. Her eyes were red, her voice trembling. "I'm sorry for everything I did, for the way I treated you. I just didn't want to be forgotten." Margaret took her hand gently. "We all fear being forgotten. But redemption starts when we stop running from who we were." Olivia broke down. "How can you forgive me after all of it?" Margaret smiled softly. Because hate is heavy, my dear. And I've carried enough weight in my life they embraced not as enemies, but as two women who had finally learned the price of pride. The light after the storm that evening. Back at the Grace home, Margaret stood before the women gathered for dinner. Her voice was steady, full of warmth. We've survived storms before, and we will again. Because grace doesn't protect us from pain. It gives us the strength to rise through it. The women clapped softly, their faces glowing in candlelight. Daniel placed a hand on her shoulder. You did it again, Mom, she smiled. No, son. We did. Outside, the sky was clear again. No storms, no shadows, just stars above a home built on love and truth. A legacy isn't what we leave for people, it's what we leave in them. The courage to love, the faith to forgive, and the grace to begin again. The months following the trial brought new life to the Grace home. New families arrived every week, women from broken marriages, widows, and young mothers with nowhere else to go, and standing among them, always calm, always kind, was Margaret Wilson, the woman the world once called the Maid. But now, she was something else entirely. She was a symbol, a living reminder that humility could heal, and forgiveness could rebuild even the most shattered souls. The new dawn. The Grace home had grown. A second building now stood beside the old cottage. A new sign hung at the entrance. The Grace Foundation, founded by Margaret and Daniel Wilson. Daniel walked beside his mother as they inspected the renovations. Can you believe this? He said, smiling. A year ago, we were struggling to prove our innocence. And now we're helping hundreds. Margaret smiled softly. Sometimes the road to peace passes through pain. It's the only way we learn what truly matters. As they walked, a young woman approached them shyly. Mrs. Wilson? Margaret turned with her warm smile. Yes, dear? My name's Lena. I wanted to thank you. My husband left me with nothing. I was ready to give up until I came here. Now I'm learning to start again. Margaret touched her hand gently. You don't need to thank me, Lena. You just needed a place to remember your worth. The rest was all you. Lena's eyes glistened. You gave me back my hope. Margaret smiled, her voice soft. Then that means Thomas's dream is still alive. The interview. Weeks later, a well-known journalist arrived to write a feature about the Grace home for a national magazine. Mrs. Wilson, she said, adjusting her recorder. You've gone from being a housemaid in your son's home to one of the most inspiring women in the country. How did you find the strength to forgive those who hurt you? Margaret looked out the window before answering. Forgiveness isn't weakness. It's freedom. When we forgive, we stop letting the pain of others define us. The journalist smiled. And what's the most important lesson life has taught you? Margaret's voice trembled slightly, but her eyes shone. That love is never wasted. Not even the love that breaks you. Because pain too can be a teacher. If we let it make us better instead of bitter. Daniel's new path. One evening, Daniel sat with his mother by the fire. The warmth flickered across their faces. Mom, he said softly, I've been thinking I want to start a program through the foundation, something for young men. To teach them what Dad taught me too late: humility, respect, compassion. Margaret's eyes filled with tears of pride. That's beautiful, Daniel. He smiled. I want to call it the Wilson way. It'll be about becoming good men, not just successful ones. She nodded. Your father would be proud. He always believed that real strength comes from kindness. Daniel looked at her lovingly. You showed me that, Mom. You turned everything we lost into something the world needed. Margaret took his hand. And you helped me believe in family again. The return of Edward King. Weeks later, a familiar car pulled up at the cottage. From it stepped Edward King, older now, walking with a cane but still carrying that dignified smile. Margaret was watering the garden when she saw him. Edward, she gasped, rushing to him. He laughed softly. Still taking care of everyone but yourself, I see. She smiled. Old habits die hard. He looked around, taking in the home, the laughter, the flowers. You've done something remarkable here, Margaret. I always knew you would. She placed a hand over his. You helped me find my voice again. I could never thank you enough for that. He shook his head. The thanks belong to you. Monarch would have collapsed without your strength and Daniel's humility. The world needs leaders like you. Margaret smiled, eyes glistening. No, Edward. The world just needs more people willing to listen to each other. A letter from the past. That evening, Daniel found his mother sitting at her desk, holding an envelope with Monarch's seal. What's that? He asked. It's from the board, she said softly. They're offering to dedicate a new branch of the Monarch Foundation in my name. That's incredible, Daniel said. She smiled wistfully. It is. But I think I'll decline. He frowned. Why? Margaret looked up at him. Because I don't need my name on buildings, Daniel. I see my legacy every day in the smiles of the people we've helped. That's enough. Daniel nodded slowly, realizing once again how rare his mother's wisdom was. The next generation. Months later, a group of children ran across the yard laughing. Margaret watched them from the porch. Her knitting in hand. Among them was a little girl, Emily, Olivia's daughter, now full of joy, running barefoot through the grass. Olivia, standing nearby, caught Margaret's eye and smiled gratefully. She loves it here, she said softly. I think I finally understand what you were trying to teach me all those years ago. Margaret nodded. Life's too short for resentment, my dear. Every day we choose love, we heal a little more. The message to the world. Later that year, Margaret gave a speech at a national charity event. Her words silenced the crowd. People once called me a maid, and they were right, because being a maid means serving others, cleaning what's broken, and restoring what's been neglected. But today, I know that's not a title of shame, it's a badge of grace. The audience rose in applause, some in tears. Daniel, watching from the front row, whispered, "You've changed the world, Mom." Margaret smiled, her eyes glistening. "No, Daniel. I just reminded it to feel again." The closing moment that night. As she sat alone by the window of her cottage, Margaret gazed at the stars. She whispered softly, "Thomas, we did it. We turned pain into something beautiful." A soft breeze passed through the curtains, carrying the faint scent of roses, and though the night was silent, she could almost hear his voice, gentle, proud, eternal. "You were never just the maid, Margaret, you were always the heart." She closed her eyes, a single tear falling, not of sorrow, but of peace. Years passed, the world changed, technology advanced. Cities grew louder, and people moved faster, but on the gentle outskirts of town, the Grace home still stood, surrounded by blooming fields and laughter. The same white cottage, the same rose garden that Thomas had once planted for Margaret. Inside, the walls whispered stories of broken hearts mended, of lives rebuilt. And at the center of it all was Margaret Wilson, now in her late 70s, still radiant in her quiet strength. Her hair was silver now, her steps slower, but her spirit unshaken. Every morning, she still walked the garden paths, greeting the women who came seeking hope. They didn't call her Mrs. Wilson anymore. They called her something far more sacred, Mother Margaret. A letter for tomorrow. One afternoon, Daniel found her sitting at her writing desk, pen in hand, surrounded by sunlight, writing another article. "Mom?" he teased gently. She smiled, not looking up. "No, my dear. Just a letter for who?" She looked at him, her eyes warm and far away. "For you and for whoever carries this legacy when I'm gone." Daniel's voice caught. "Mom, don't talk like that," she chuckled softly. "Daniel, love isn't meant to end. It just changes form. You'll understand someday." Margaret's letter. "My dearest Daniel, if you're reading this, I've simply gone home, not far, just beyond where your eyes can see. Remember, my son, wealth fades, titles vanish, but love outlives us all. The Grace home was never just a building. It's a promise that no heart should ever feel forgotten. No life should ever be deemed too small to matter. So, when life becomes heavy again, look for someone to lift. That's how you'll keep me alive. And when you see roses bloom after a storm, know it's me reminding you that grace always grows in the hardest places. With love that never ends, Mom." The last sunset. Weeks later, on a golden evening, Margaret sat in her garden with Daniel and little Emily, Olivia's daughter, who now called Margaret her grandmother. They laughed as Emily picked roses, giggling with joy. "Careful with those thorns," Margaret said gently. Emily grinned. "But Grandma, you said even thorns protect something beautiful." Margaret smiled, that soft, knowing smile that had carried her through a lifetime. "Yes, darling. And they do." As the sun began to set, painting the sky in gold and crimson, Margaret closed her eyes, her hand resting on Daniel's. "I'm so proud of you," she whispered. He held her hand tightly. "I love you, Mom." "I know," she said, her voice fading into a sigh. "And I've loved you through every version of you." Her eyes lifted one last time toward the horizon, and then slowly, peacefully, she was gone. No pain, no fear, just peace, and roses. The farewell. The entire town gathered for her memorial at the Grace home. Hundreds of women stood holding white roses, the symbol of grace. Daniel spoke through tears, but with pride. "My mother wasn't a hero in the way the world defines it. She didn't seek power, fame, or wealth. She simply loved fiercely, endlessly, and without condition. And in doing so, she changed every life she touched." As he finished, the crowd released their roses into the river beside the cottage, white petals floating downstream, carried by the current like blessings. Years later, 10 years past, the Grace home had grown into a global foundation, with centers in cities around the world, and at every branch, a portrait of Margaret Wilson hung in the entrance, beneath a quote etched in gold. "Grace doesn't erase pain. It transforms it." Daniel now served as chairman. Olivia oversaw outreach programs for single mothers, and little Emily, now grown, became the new director of the Grace home. The Rose Garden lives. On one spring morning, Emily visited the old cottage, now preserved as a memorial. She walked through the garden, where roses still bloomed brighter than ever as the wind brushed her cheek. She smiled softly. "Grandma," she whispered, "we kept your promise." The world still remembers. A single petal drifted down, landing on her hand. And though the air was still, she could almost hear her grandmother's voice, gentle, warm, eternal. "I never left, my darling. I just became the garden." Emily looked up at the sky, tears glistening in her eyes, not of sorrow, but of love that never dies. Final lines. Once, they called her the Maid, but history remembered her as something far greater, the woman who taught the world what grace means. The end.